Hey guys, welcome back. I wanted to talk about this super commodities boom that we've started, and we're actually we're well into it. Started in 2020. I wouldn't say well into. This is something that's going to last for more than a decade. I think that we're going to start seeing prices climb for the next decade, and this is a pretty big deal for a lot of people, especially at a time where it's already hard for many people to be able to afford things. But the prices of commodities across the board appear to be rising higher. Now, some of this is unavoidable, and some of this is just poor policy making, in my opinion. But I don't know if you guys have noticed, but our president has been pretty much non-existent since taking office. We have Kamala Harris out negotiating with other countries. We've seen very few press reports. This is a little concerning. And like I've said before in the past, I'm not 100% sure that he is capable of doing his job. So I don't want to put all the pressure on the ancient one, but if we don't get a handle on some of these commodity prices, and they do continue to run the way that I think that they're going to run, we're talking about one of the largest humanitarian crises in our lifetime. Right now, as it sits, 25 million Americans every year can't afford their power bill. They have to cut back on their grocery bill to pay their power bill. And 10 million Americans actually have to keep their homes at an unsafe temperature. So when we're talking about commodity prices rising, we're talking about the prices of the basic needs of people going up. We're talking about a substantial issue, especially if they rise too high too quickly. And we've already seen after they bottomed out in 2020. I did a video on this talking about 2020 being the start of this commodity boom back in either December, the end of December 2019, or the beginning of in January 2020. I'll post a link up above. But we started this cycle kind of mid 2020, and it has just been raging ever since. We've seen prices going up fairly quickly across the board when it comes to food and energy, and I think it's going to continue that way across a lot of different sectors. But today I'm going to talk to you mainly about food and energy, because energy does impact the food pricing quite a bit, and it's going to be a factor that pushes prices higher. There was a Bloomberg analyst last October who made a call that said that we would see an 18% increase in precious metals. That's really kind of your inflation right there, because we're seeing monetary inflation at the same time. And then he said that you would see about a 30% increase in food prices. We've already seen food prices rise substantially since October, and they're going to continue to go up. And then he also said we're going to see about a 50% increase in energy. We've already seen a 43% increase in oil just since he published those notes. So he's not far off from what he was saying. There was another analyst several weeks ago who was calling for $18 a bushel in corn, $30 a bushel in soybeans, and close to $45 or $48 a bushel for wheat by 2023. That's just 2 years away. And that sounds a little far-fetched at first. It sounds a little crazy at first. Some people think that he was talking about a period of hyperinflation. Folks, that's not hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is when things double overnight. But based on the fundamentals of the market and the things that are going on in the market, the pricing that he was speculating on for 2023, a 400% increase in those key grains, is not far off. If you look at vegetable oil, we've seen 100% gain in vegetable oil over the past year. And vegetable oil, again, is a key ingredient for a lot of the foods that we eat, a lot of the processed foods that many consumers have to consume because they can't afford, or they have little access to natural, healthy foods. So these prices are rising, and they're rising for a lot of reasons, not just inflation, but inflation is a part of that, and I'll get to that because we just passed another $2 trillion bill, and obviously anytime that you put that much money into the economy, you're causing some sort of inflation. We've had over a decade now of very easy money policy. We've pumped a lot of money into Wall Street. Wall Street has, if you look at the numbers, Wall Street has been going through a period of inflation. That inflation is essentially switching over to Main Street, and that's where it's going to hurt your pocketbook. So let's get into crops. Why are crops going up so much? We've talked about this a lot on our channel, but we've had some severe weather patterns over the past couple of years that have really kind of made it difficult to grow crops for a lot of farmers. We've had Things like in 2019, we had the no plant 2019, which brought us to a late harvest in 2019, which impacted plantings in 2020. And then we had the things like the derecho storm that affected a lot of our corn crop in 2020. In sunny Purdue, when he was in office, he constantly was known for giving very sunny forecasts of what our crops would look like for the year. And none of them ever really came to fruition because we just weren't planting that many acres. He was very, very uplifting with the way he would talk about our crops, but they just weren't there. And the fundamentals that we're seeing now are so bad. They're probably the worst that we've seen in years when it comes to supply and demand. It would take a couple years of perfect crop production just to catch up to where demand is, because demand hasn't slowed down. Our population keeps growing globally. And there are other things affecting demand right now too, but just to get the fundamentals back on track, it would take a couple good years of perfect crops. And from what I gather about these changes in our climate and weather, these aren't man-made changes, but these are natural cycles that we're going through. And based on those natural cycles, it's going to be relatively difficult to meet such a lofty goal. Even if we did meet that lofty goal, we'd probably see prices continue to rise up until 2022 just to catch up to where they should be, fundamentally speaking. And if we have another bad crop year in 2021 or 2022 or 2023, somewhere in there, we'll probably have a couple of them in there. What we'll see is, the fundamentals get even worse, pushing the price even higher. So the weather conditions have definitely impacted a lot of crops. And it's not just these key grains. When we talk about crops on this channel, I bring up a lot of the key grains, the commodity pricing, because that is how it works its way down the scale, and I'll get to that in just a second. But we're also looking at these weather patterns starting to affect other crops. We saw over 230 million plus dollars worth of damage to the citrus crops in Texas. They had 60 to 90% of some of their crops in Texas completely wiped out. And when you think about the southern states, which states actually supply us with a lot of those nutritional requirements, Texas is a pretty big state. The cost of transporting those goods from some of the other states is going to raise the pricing of things like citrus fruits in the near term. And then you're also looking at a supply issue again, because you're missing out on a very large part of the industry there. We lost over $130 million, and they're still calculating worth of vegetable crops. That's a significant amount. I think the entire loss in Texas is over $600 million, and they're still processing claims. So that number is most likely going to continue to rise from Winter Storm Uri. And you're also looking at about a $230 million loss in livestock. Livestock is something I'm going to get to in this video as well, because we're definitely seeing some impacts on the livestock industry from some of these grain prices. And again, wheat is one of those things where Russia has now, I think they're double taxing exports pretty much. They're trying to reduce as much exports as possible. They're one of the largest wheat producers in the world. And last year we saw a lot of wheat producers cut back on their amount of wheat. Here in the U.S. with Winter Storm Uri, that Arctic outbreak, it's still, we have to wait until our winter wheat really starts to green up to see what the damage is. We know that there's a chance for more damage than in that storm and that Arctic outbreak than there is in December, January timeframe, because the crop is a little less tolerant of those temperatures as you get into February, March. So we're expecting to see some damage in the wheat crops there, and with Russia putting taxes on exports and trying to cut back on exports, and I think other countries will follow suit as we get into the spring. Wheat is something that will definitely climb more than, last year I said it would climb 40%. It did from its lows, it climbed up over 40%, but I still think that there's a long way for wheat to go even this year. Fundamentally, it's still underpriced. Weather is definitely having an impact on our ability to meet demand, our ability to grow to meet demand. When we look around the world, we've had bad weather patterns kind of all over the world. This past winter, one of the big stories was the South America and how the the La Nina was impacting dry weather in South America, making it a little more difficult to catch up on corn and soybeans. So we're seeing a little bit of a weakness there. Part of the vegetable oil problem is relating to actually sunflowers in the Baltic Sea area, because again, you had a really hot, dry summer up there that affected sunflower production. Sunflower oil went up, and then you also had down in Italy and some of the countries that produce our olive oil, you saw a substantial impact on olive oil when we started seeing a lot of diseases hit the trees. I did a video on that last year, and so it's no surprise that you saw a 100% increase in vegetable oil. There were other issues in other countries as well that produce vegetable oil, so it's kind of been a lot of these bigger commodities are driven by global forces. When you look at China, for example, China had a lot of the grains that they had in storage turned out to be bad. They've had to replace a lot of those grains because of the African swine fever. They've been having to rebuild their herds. They no longer allow feeding their hog herds squill, so you're seeing more corn and grains being put into the hog feed. And I think that the demand from grains just in the China hog industry is going to continue to rise because they're still rebuilding their herds. They're still trying to get a handle on the African swine fever situation. So you're going to continue to see prices rise and demand rise over there as well. In fact, China and a lot of these socialist countries, what you'll see them do is the government will come in often and they'll put in place a minimum price guarantee on crops so that a farmer can at least grow a crop and know that they're going to be covering their bases. It's an encouragement to the farmers to go ahead and grow the crops. A lot of times, though, these price guarantees end up dictating the market a little bit, and so you end up having subdued prices on crops because the market kind of adjusts to that minimum price instead of moving higher. It does put more crops on the market, so you don't have that national rationing, which helps bring up the price and make the cropping a little more productive. And so I don't agree with having something in there to correct the market like that, but they had removed it in 2018. They had removed that mechanism in 2018, and now they've brought it back, and not only have they brought it back, but they've risen the price that they're going to pay for crops for the first time since 2014. And the reason why China is doing that is because they're trying to encourage more crop production domestically because they are completely unself-sustainable. And they've been buying so many grains from around the world, they're going to continue at least, from what I hear, at least what they purchased in 2020, they will do in 2021. They have some very lofty storage goals that they're trying to meet right now. Plus, they're trying to rebuild their herds, their pig herds. So it's adding a lot of pressure to the demand side of a lot of these grains. And then on top of that, China's also trying to encourage more livestock production as far as cattle are concerned. They traditionally haven't grown a lot of cattle. So we're going to see continued pressure from China on grain prices to the upside. A good example, I was just talking about China putting in these price mechanisms. A good example of how bad policy can lead to astronomical food pricing very quickly is Zimbabwe. When you look at Zimbabwe, they did a massive land redistribution. And when they did that, they found that their productivity actually went down. Apparently, redistributing the wealth does not increase productivity. So they had a drop in productivity, and food prices started going up because you had a supply and demand issue. You had more demand than there was supply, and food prices started rising. So they put in a market mechanism to basically keep the pricing of food affordable for everybody. Basically, they put a cap on how much you would have to pay for a lot of these food products. And what we ended up seeing there was, without the natural rationing of an open market where food prices go up when supply is low and people buy less, you ended up seeing supplies completely diminish and run out. And the other problem that they ran into is that the cost of inputs with inflation, because Zimbabwe was spending a lot of money, went above the price cap that they had put on food, so it became completely unaffordable for farmers to grow food. And it kind of snowballed from there, because as their agricultural sector declined and they were unable to really control food prices. The entire agricultural sector brought down a lot of the government revenue, and the government was overspending, and that turned around and impacted lending. And what you saw in Zimbabwe was, kind of runaway inflation turn into hyperinflation, and then the whole thing just turned into a mess. So you can see a hyperinflation scenario evolve out of some of the things that we're starting to see now. And that's something to be very concerned about. And again, we just pumped another $2 trillion into our economy. That's basically $5,000 per person in America. Now, only some people are actually going to see $1,400. Luckily, some of that money is going to people in prison, so it won't necessarily make it back into the cycle again. I heard Bernie Madoff is having a high-stakes poker game. But anyway, you've got, these funds that are just being thrown out there, easy money, and a lot of it's going into pet projects where they want, higher investment dollars, or in some cases there are some states that mismanage their funds, and so some of the funds are going towards that. And it's going to put too much money into the economy. We're already seeing inflationary pressures hit everything from energy to food, and we're just throwing more money at it. It really isn't a good policy, and like I said, I don't think that our leadership is all there at the moment, and those who are put into these positions, we came into an administration that appointed people into positions based on agenda and not really based on expertise. I think it would be very hard for anybody to argue rationally that some of these plans and these bills and these policies are actually benefiting us. So an example of bad policy making would be shutting down pipelines. So the thought process behind a lot of these pipelines is that they're environmentally bad. Well, oil is environmentally bad because it causes CO2, which causes global warming. I would argue that there are other environmental concerns, especially when it comes to natural concerns, that we should be focusing our attention on. But they want to shut down these pipelines. They want to make oil more expensive so that more private investment will go into some of this greener technology, and I guess the hopes is that it will become more viable as they invest more into it. But in order to do so, you have to raise the cost of your traditional energy sources in order to get people to put more focus on that. I know that Texas put a lot of focus on alternative energy resources, and it didn't work out too well for them. But when we look at shutting down the pipelines, first of all, there's a lot of reports on this. It's been proven pretty much that transporting the oil through the pipelines versus above ground is substantially safer. You have much less of a chance of having an accident and an oil spill. And then on top of that, you're talking about a 66 to 77% decrease in emissions by transporting it in these oil lines under the ground. And I recognize that some of these oil lines are running through some protected territories, and I do think that we should be leaving those territories alone. Of course, when we looking at some of the agricultural policies coming out, when we look at logging, the plan right now is that we're going to try and promote more wood burning for energy, so that we can release more carbon, I guess. And we're also going to be promoting more wood products, and the 100-day climate agenda for the USDA published by the Biden administration, they're going to be going on a massive logging spree and promote wood products. And part of that logging is going to occur on tribal lands as well. So when we talk about protecting tribal lands from pipelines, but then we are also promoting a policy or trying to implement a policy for a different industry to go onto tribal lands and take their timber, that's not necessarily doing much to protect those lands that should be rightfully theirs. In any case, one of the pipelines that I'm concerned about being shut down is actually the Dakota pipeline, which goes from North Dakota through South Dakota, Iowa, and then ends in Illinois. And this pipeline is very detrimental when it comes to food pricing. And you're probably wondering, what does oil have to do with food pricing? Well, if you shut down the Dakota pipeline, what ends up happening is that all of that oil, you still have to have oil. You have to have oil to mine the precious metals that we're pulling out of the ground to create the alternative energy resources that we're building. You have to have coal to forge the wind turbines. But when you move the transportation of that oil from below ground in pipelines to above ground by rail, what's going to happen to the railways? They're going to get extremely busy. They're going to get backed up with a lot of oil. And right now we transport a lot of our grains in the Midwest by rail. Because if you transport grains by rail, it's only, let's say with corn, about $1.30 a bushel in cost to transport it. So you're paying, $5 or $6 a bushel for the corn, and then $1.30 to transport it. If you move that transportation from rail to truck, which is what they'll have to do if they shut down the Dakota pipeline, you're looking at increasing the cost of transportation per bushel up to about $3.80. And then on top of that, you're making oil more expensive because instead of transporting it below ground, which is the cheapest way, you're now transporting it by rail, which is increasing the cost of the energy. And so as you increase the cost of oil and gas, you're increasing the cost of the transportation by truck, so that almost 400% increase in cost of transportation of grains is going to actually be even more than that. So when we start talking about grains going up 400%, you could actually see the cost of grains go up 200% just from one bad decision on how it's, and on something that would impact how it's transported. It's expected that shutting down the Dakota pipeline, just based off of the current market fundamentals, would cost the farmers about $1 billion, which would actually end up rolling back onto the consumers. And so the consumers would pick up that extra $1 billion, which again, I think would be a lot higher than that, considering all the variables. Everything kind of has a snowball effect. It doesn't just stop with one piece of the puzzle. So the Dakota pipeline is a pretty big deal when it comes to food pricing. You could see a substantial rise in grain prices here in the U.S. just from shutting down one pipeline that is actually rather strategic in keeping our food prices low. But if you don't explain this to consumers, or you don't explain this to the people who you are getting to advocate for some of these things, they're not thinking about the consequences of their actions all the way down the line. What would be a smarter way of handling things would be to allow the market itself to transition at its own pace into some of these alternative energies. When you try and force something on a market, you're actually putting everybody at danger. And when you're already in a situation where supply is not meeting demand and prices are already naturally rising, you're lighting a fire under something that could cause a humanitarian crisis. And I hate to put that on the Ancient One right now, but the policies that are coming out are definitely they have this ability to trigger a much larger crisis that is going to be hard to get a grasp on. The Federal Reserve can't just turn on and off a switch and expect inflation to turn on and turn off. They think they can do that. And I don't understand what economic school these people went to, but you can't actually do that. Some of these things are, the pricing that we're seeing, that we've been seeing rise, are outside of that control. If you look at the variable rates, for example, the Fed has kept rates pretty low, but we started seeing the past week variable rates go up. If you have a mortgage on your home, I would suggest you, if you can, to go ahead and refinance now. If you have credit cards, you need to get rid of those, even if it means refinancing your house to pay off your credit cards, because as the variable rates rise, your credit cards are based on a variable rate. And you could end up going from 18% to 36% in the next 6 to 8 months. And I'm not even joking about that. But as these rates start to rise, the rates are rising naturally on their own. And the Fed doesn't really have tools to pull rates down anymore. And so as things start to heat up, as we start to see some inflationary pressures, you're going to see the rate rise naturally. And that's when we end up in a situation where I think we're headed right now, where you kind of have runaway inflation. It's not going to be hyperinflation, but it's definitely going to be a runaway inflationary rate that they're going to have a hard time throwing a lasso around and pulling back down. We've had, like I said, over a decade of easy monetary policy, and then over the last 2 years we've pumped trillions of dollars into the economy, expanded the Fed balance sheet. We've gotten to the point where we're printing a ton of money just to buy our own debt. This is a very bad situation. This is a bad situation we've seen all around the world. We've entered into a new realm where we are operating off of an academic theory that it's okay for our debt to exceed our GDP, and it hasn't been a proven theory. And really, when we look at history, we look at some very poor examples of what happens when our debt ratio gets too high. Even a consumer, anybody who manages their own finances knows this. I wanted to talk about meat real quick because I mentioned that these prices and things are already affecting the protein market. Now, it's important to note that on Biden's USDA transition team, he actually does have folks on the team, I can't remember their names off the top of my head, that are in the alternative protein sector. They're into this lab-grown stuff, and so there may be, a conscientious effort here. I'm not sure, but what we've seen lately, if you look at, for example, poultry, chicken wings are up over 40% year over year. Chicken breasts are up close to 30% year over year. If you like chicken quarters, I love chicken quarters, which is the thigh and the leg. I love throwing those on the grill with some barbecue sauce. They are perfect. Those have actually gone down about 15-20% year over year, but for the most part, poultry has gone up. But I noticed an interesting thing happen in the poultry industry recently, and that is that we saw over a 3% decrease in new chicks going out. So we're putting out less birds into these chicken houses. So if you're actually a contract farmer, you might want to listen to this part of this video because this is going to impact you. You have less chicks going out. Your job is to raise those chicks in your chicken house, and then when you haul them off, they haul them off in a truck and they weigh them and you get paid based on the weight of the truck. Well, the chicks that are going out, they're also bringing back smaller breeds of broilers. And a lot of this has to do with the cost of grains, the cost of feed, the cost of the inputs. They're going up, and so they're managing that by reducing the number of birds going out and downsizing the birds. So when you take that truck to the packaging plant, that truck's going to weigh a lot less. And because that truck's weighing a lot less, there's a lot less protein going on to the market, and that's where supply gets a little tighter with demand. So you're going to start seeing, consumers are going to see their pricing going up. Contract farmers are going to start seeing their earnings going down, at least until the pricing at the retail level catches up. Of course, as we know, when things at retail go up, it doesn't necessarily impact the farmer. We've seen the big top 5 meat packaging companies in this Department of Justice lawsuit. Many of you probably don't know this, but they've, for the most part, pled guilty and paid $150, $200 million fines, which is a drop in the bucket. We're talking about these guys control 90% of a $50 billion a year industry, and they're paying traffic ticket fines, pretty much. So for pleading guilty to price manipulation and taking advantage of the farmers. It's a very sad thing, but it's just how things kind of work. So we're going to see a decrease in chicken production. The other thing, in the pork industry, we're up to about $70 per 100 pounds in a cost basis for pork. So pork pricing is going to go up because the inputs are extremely high. But another thing that they've been doing in the pork industry is, again, they're looking at ways to offset the cost of their inputs, and so you're seeing less expansion in the pork industry, except for in China. They're trying to get back online. But here domestically, we're seeing less expansion in the pork industry, and we're also seeing producers start to evaluate ways to put less pounds on the pigs. So you're going to have less poundage of protein hitting the marketplace, which again creates a supply and demand issue. We're probably going to see something happen with the feeder cattle market as well because of grain prices going up. Just because we're seeing prices rise, like grains, corn, even livestock, pricing rise, it does not mean that it's rising at a rate that's going to increase the profit margin to a farmer. And the inflationary pressures on the inputs right now are keeping them relatively in balance. So even though you're seeing higher prices, unless you're a very clever farmer, your inputs are also going up. You have to start kind of putting your brain to this and figuring out what you can do. And again, like I said, if you're a contract farmer, you're probably looking at a tighter margin anyway, because what you're being supplied to grow is being reduced in size and number. One of the ways that I think farmers could control some of their inputs when it comes to energy, obviously I would love to have solar panels. I'd love to be off the grid on our property. I think that when it comes to an individual residence, some of these alternative renewable energy resources could be very useful at reducing your costs. And again, I was talking about loans before. If you could get that in a fixed rate loan now, you're better off, because as energy prices climb, let's say you find a company to do solar panels on your house and it offsets your power bill. Well, if your power bill is 200% higher in a year from now because energy prices are rising, that fixed rate loan that you have on your solar panels is still going to be about the same. And I think that it's almost they're almost forcing the market to go into that type of direction. So anything you can do energy wise to save on your farm is going to help increase your profit margins. Your energy costs are going up. We're looking at, Bloomberg said 50% increase in 2021. I think that they were low on that. I think he was being conservative. We're actually seeing energy prices climb as we speak. And fuel prices are going up. So if you have the ability of having a fuel tank on your property that you can keep full and fill it when prices dip, then again, you're buying low, you're keeping your margins low, but you have to actively manage that. You have to be able to stay on top of what's happening in the industry and take advantage of the dips to top off the tank. When we talk about inflation, we talk about prices going up, it does impact the economy in a recessionary way. So while we're having to pay more for commodities, and this is a commodity boom that's not going to stop anytime soon. When you look at the oil cycles, for example, oil cycles usually last a little over a decade, maybe 12 years. The last oil cycle was on a downswing for 12 years and ended when Trump left office, and now it's turning around and going back up. Before that, it went up for 12 years and peaked in 2008. So we're definitely seeing, some of these commodity cycles kind of hit at the same time, and they're all going up at the same time. And so when we as consumers and people who have to live off of energy, have to live off of food, and we're all of a sudden in a position where we have to pay more for that food and for that energy, we're going to spend less on consumer goods and services. And so you start to see a retraction, and that creates a recession. If you look at the 1980s, we had an inflationary period that ended in 1980, and we saw a recession that hit from about 1980 through 1983. Peak unemployment in 1982 was around 11%. And what we saw with COVID was not a part of this cycle, I don't think. I think that the unemployment numbers that we saw in COVID, I don't think that they're ever going to recover back to where they were, because the markets have changed. Businesses have had to change how they do things in order to remain viable throughout the pandemic. And so as we go into this period of inflationary pressures and pricing going up on a lot of commodities, we're going to continue to see pressures that push us into a recessionary period. Rubini is somebody who I've covered a lot on this channel in the past, and a lot of his predictions were very similar. Starting in 2020, we would be going into at least a decade or more of a recessionary period. We have really artificially kind of fed Wall Street, fed this economy for so long that it's unsustainable, and the fundamentals aren't there, and it has to go through a correction. You can't expect to just live life without having market corrections. And unfortunately, the more you try and prolong it, the more you kick that can down the road, the harder it's going to hit everybody. And I think that's pretty much where we're heading at this moment in time. Now, as an individual, I talked about a little bit about some of the ideas that you can implement as a farmer to offset your input costs. Knowing as an individual that you're heading into a period of higher input costs, you also need to start thinking about what you can do to reconcile yourself with this changing economy, to be able to afford the things that you need to have in order to live, feed your family, and be comfortable. Now, raising your own food, raising your own livestock, growing your own vegetable gardens, the Victory Gardens, the Edwardian time gardens, I think that is an economy that we're heading back to. You almost have to. The only way that you can really reconcile yourself against rising food prices that could go up 400% by 2023, is to grow your own food. If you can grow your own food and offset that grocery bill as much as you possibly can, you're better off. If you can keep some of the needs for those commodities lower, you're better off. If you get rid of your credit cards so you don't have variable rates, if you can if you can right now, I wouldn't do it, as interest rates continue to go up. But right now, if you can get yourself into some alternative energy, again, I think that those payments on that alternative energy are going to be substantially less in 2 years than paying for that energy. So those are ways that you can kind of reconcile and allow your life to continue and be able to do the things that you need to do as these costs continue to go up. The other thing that you need to do is figure out what you can barter. You can barter services. You can barter if you're growing more food than you need. You can barter food. Food is going to become more valuable in the future. It's going to rise at a higher level in price than precious metals. Precious metals going up 18% this year aren't necessarily the best hedge against inflation. I mean, they might be against the broader inflationary market, but when you look at food and how much food is going to go up, imagine what food is worth on a bartering scale. Food is going to be worth a lot more. There are people who I would barter with to get a cow or something, because we can't get into some of the packaging facilities to process our own. I would barter with them on a service that might be even worth a little more than what their cow is, just because I know the value of that food to me, and I know that once I get a cow in my freezers, it's going to last me for another year, and I'm figuring in my cost basis all the way through that year, and I think that's worth it. So we've got to this point now where bartering is going to become a new economic system. Some people are getting into cryptocurrencies. I dabble in some cryptocurrencies as well. How viable they are, a lot of people would argue that they're a lot different than a fiat currency, but the truth is with every currency, it's just a bartering tool. A service or a product that you actually have is always going to be worth more than any currency is, especially if things get really bad. You want to have services, you want to have products that you're putting out that are of value, that are a necessity to others. The more necessary it is, the more valuable it is on a barter. I know the government doesn't like bartering because they don't get taxes on it, but sometimes it's what you have to do. And that's the other thing, tax rates are going up. Tax rates on everything from personal property, your investments. It almost is becoming foolish to hold on to too much cash at the moment anyway. Investing into some of these resources that you're going to be able to trade and barter with in the future is probably a wiser decision at this point in time. And that's, Elon Musk made the comment couple weeks ago where he said that holding on to cryptocurrency was almost, the key word there is almost, as stupid as holding on to fiat currency. And he talked about how he doesn't hold any investments, he just reinvests into his business. But he's creating something that other people are wanting, and he's getting a return on that, regardless of what the resource is. They're going to start accepting cryptocurrencies for some of their cars, but that's smart economics, putting your money into an investment that's going to be working capital for you and what you're trying to do. If you have a bunch of cash sitting under your mattress and inflation goes up 200% over a couple years, well, you just lost 50% of the cash sitting under that mattress. So I would definitely start thinking of ways, creative ways that you can invest into your future with products and services that you could also turn around and use as a bartering tool for those that have products and services that you require. So I hope this video was helpful to some of you guys. I know that I have talked a lot on this channel over the last couple of years about commodity pricing going up over the next decade. We're definitely seeing it now. We're seeing the pressures in place. Most of these pressures are unavoidable. And then when you add on top of that poor policy decisions at a time when these prices are already going up, you're really setting us up for a hyperinflation scenario down the road. And I think it's going to be hard to manage that type of scenario in a definitive recession once you hit runaway inflation. And I actually think right now we're on the brink of runaway inflation. I think within the next 6 to 8 months, you will start seeing in the financial markets a lot of people talking about concern about runaway inflation. You're going to start to see the Federal Reserve trying to tighten their belt to slow it down, and that's when you're going to have the interest rates popping really hard. All of these things are going to happen within the next 6 to 8 months. If you haven't gotten seeds, find some seeds and start growing your own food. I know it's been difficult to find seeds lately. A lot of the companies that were selling seeds to consumers have restricted a lot of their sales on the commercial side. But if you know somebody who has some seeds, maybe you could trade with them for something. Stick with the heirlooms so that you can regenerate your own seeds going forward, and just do the best that you can to plan and manage. Right now, we should all be planning and managing ourselves and our futures based on a substantial rise. When we're talking not 20%, we're talking several 100% rise in our cost basis for all of these commodities.